Once again, everyone, welcome and thank you for attending today's roundtable. Again, my name is Tony Staffaroni. I'm the Stakeholder and Community Relations Manager. Before we go around the room, I will have my colleagues introduce themselves, and then everybody at the table can go ahead and introduce themselves once again, please.
I'm Chris Hall. I'm the Director of Finance and Administration at CAP.
Good afternoon, Doug Dunlap, Finance and Accounting Manager at CAP.
Darrell Funk, Business Financial Planning Supervisor.
Gretchen Irwin, City of Goodyear.
Wally Wilson, Water Resource Manager for Metro Water District, and on some of these topics I'll be speaking for SAWA.
Fred Stevens, City of Surprise, Water Resources.
Drews Wiskowski, City of Glendale.
Chris Connor, City of Chandler.
Craig Caggiano, City of Tempe.
I'm still Eric Brown from Gilbert.
Cynthia Campbell, City of Phoenix.
Mike Loggins, Apache Junction Water District.
Lacey James, City of Avondale.
Warren Tenney with AMWA.
Right, and so for those of you who were here last year, you may have heard that Gary Given departed, and so Darrell is our new Gary, just to let introduce you to him and put a face with the name. I'm sure you'll be hearing more from him in the future. My briefing today is very quick because I'm much more anxious to hear from all of you on these topics. But I did want to kind of set the parameters of the ground rules of the things that we kind of understand to be true in terms of the calculations and things like that, so that we're all kind of operating from the same level of assumptions. But there is no, if you were here last year, you might remember we did kind of 3 options. We're not presenting a list of options today for you to pick from or react to. This is more of a, here's some broad concepts, and we'd really like to get your feedback. Last year, we also did this in late March, and then we were heading to FAP in a couple weeks after with a recommendation. Now we have, it's much earlier in the year, so that the downside of that is some of the numbers aren't as firm as they will be in a couple of months. But the good news is that we can have kind of an ongoing conversation for the next couple of months to really get on the same page with what the expectations are. So I'm hoping this will work. It'll be a little bit different from how we did last year. So just to start off, the assumptions that we're basing our calculations on is that in the upcoming tax year, we assume that 1 cent of property tax will generate about $5.8 million in revenue. And if we were to apply 1 cent of tax towards repayment, that would lower capital charges by about $8.50. Of course, we round to the nearest dollar, so it just depends on which dollar it lands on, whether it would go up or down from there. And then if you look at the back of our budget, we have a modified advisory rate for 2021 of $66 an acre foot. As you know, the board policy is that we start at assuming that for repayment, everything will fall to capital charges that isn't picked up by the Basin Development Fund. You might also recall that last year we obligated 1 penny of 2020 tax towards 2021 to kind of lop off the top of that spike that we highlighted. So that's built into that. So you take those two things into consideration, and if you loaded everything else onto the capital charge, if you just kind of said that's your baseline, that's what that $66 an acre foot represents. And I put a little asterisk there that due to some other calculations that we still have ongoing, it's very likely that that's going to come down a little bit more by $1 or $2 an acre foot just through doing nothing else. But I just wanted to make you aware of that. Also, just kind of setting the level of where we are now in the year that we just started. This is what the board approved last spring. So there was 4.5 cents of the general ad valorem tax going to the ag consideration. Then through the DCP efforts, there was about $5 million, or about 1 cent, that went to Pinal Ag Infrastructure. Then 1.5 cents went to reducing the 2020 capital charge. 1 cent went to the 2021 reduction of capital charges going towards repayment. And then 2 cents was set aside for the extraordinary cost reserves, specifically with the anticipation that it would be transferred to the NGS fund and to pay down the costs of decommissioning. So That's where the 10 cent was, and then we reserved all 4 cents of the water storage tax for the water bank to purchase long-term storage credits. So that's where we are right now today. So looking ahead to 2021, the tax year 2021, here's just some things that we're keeping our eye on, I guess, and I just put some rough estimates down as to what we think those might cost now. The ag consideration, again, is about 4.5 cents. That's largely unchanged from the prior year. Extraordinary cost reserve, after we transferred the money from the extraordinary cost reserve to NGS decommissioning, that pretty much wiped out that entire fund. We then started back at zero and started collecting more money into it since then, and there's about $7 million in there right now. But when you think about some of these recent extraordinary costs that have occurred that are tens of millions of dollars or maybe even hundreds of millions of dollars, that isn't something we can just build up in a single year. So having a fund that puts these dollars aside ahead of time for those unplanned expenses that go beyond strategic reserve type uses, that might be something that we want to look at replenishing. Historically, we've done about 2 cents a year, but we could look at that. That's something we could work on. And then if you were watching FAP today, Doug did a great job of presenting where we have put aside about $134 million for decommissioning. And with the final negotiations wrapping up, it looks like we're going to need to kick in about another $26 million for the settlement. And so that equates to about 4.5 cents. Of course, that's the liability, and we don't have to necessarily fund that all at once. But so I put in a range of about 2.5 to 4.5 cents there, just as kind of a placeholder, because at some point we will have to fund that additional liability. The water storage tax, again, we're just looking at probably 4 cents for the water bank. And then the other options, which I'm really eager to hear from you on, is reducing the capital charges, reducing tax rates, any other uses that we may not have contemplated, or any other concerns you might have about taxes and capital charges. I would be really interested to hear your perspectives on that. So that's question one. Question two, we also talked about today in the FAP, and that's the voluntary rate stabilization. A little history on this is 26 customers. I think it's mistyped on there. M&I customers. I think it's 26 customers opted into this this program. There's about $7 million in this fund. This is over and above the $30 million of regular rate stabilization that we have. This is a voluntary program. And the idea of this fund was to avoid rate shock in the event of a shortage. And there was a clock put on this fund. If a shortage wasn't declared after 5 years, this program would cease and the refunds would be issued to the participants. Well, 2020 is year 5, and it doesn't look like a shortage is going to be called. So we want to get feedback today and throughout the next couple of weeks and months from all of you about, do you want to extend the program? Do you want to roll into a new type of program? Do you just want to say, we're done, we want a refund? It's kind of like the last discussion that we just had. There's several options, and we'd really like to take the pulse of where everybody's coming down on that particular issue as well. So with that, that's really short and sweet this year, but I would love to hear your perspectives on those topics.
So again, just like we've done at previous roundtables, we'd like to go around the room, have everyone make their comments, questions, and we'll have everyone speak. And then at that point, we can then, if we have any follow-up questions from CAP staff, et cetera, we'll go ahead and do that. So with that being said, we'll go with Warren. If you'd like to start, go right ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to just focus mainly on the capital charge discussion first. And, we have, for a couple of years now, the AMWA cities have been really emphasizing and wanting to emphasize that we see that the federal debt repayment, sort of the mortgage payment for constructing CAP, is the most important expenditure. And so with the closure of NGS, we're seeing that CAP basically has 2 revenue sources now for that federal repayment, and that would be taxes and capital charges. And so we certainly appreciate last year that the board specifically designated was a cent and a half for the of tax money specifically for federal repayment. And we want to continue to advocate for having tax money specifically designated towards federal repayment and not place all of the burden of the federal debt repayment solely on the M&I subcontractors. We think it's also really important to be able to show the board, stakeholders, and the general public that there is a plan regarding taxes and how those taxes can be, how CAP is envisioning to use them. We understand and appreciate that you want to have flexibility with that, but as far as with that mortgage payment, it's pretty set and what the federal debt repayment is. And so that's something that we feel could be kind of looked at beyond just 1 year. And look forward out and see, okay, how can we make sure that's going to be taken care of through a combination of both capital charges and taxes. And we believe that is something worth looking at because, as we have said before, we view the capital charges are separate from OM&R rates, and that they're not a water delivery rate. They're an access fee that is paid on the full M&I allocation, regardless of whatever amount is delivered. And so we believe that it would be helpful if CAP began to present those capital charges distinctly from its rates. It would help with discussions with the board as well as discussions with us. And we would appreciate if CAP would also look at how the capital charges impact our budgets. And I know CAP has tried to be helpful in having the projected rates and as well as capital charges of what's expected looking out forward. But particularly with capital charges, that's one area, but again, because you know what the federal repayment's going to be and figuring out the combination ahead of time, that could help a lot because currently, as it is set up with the board rate setting policy, it's required that capital charges be calculated based on how that the federal repayment be based all on capital charges, and that annually the board would consider taxes being used. The challenge there is we're then planning our budgets based on the worst case scenario, so to speak, and so we're locking up monies that we could have being used and or designated for maintenance and other key operational improvements that we need for our systems. So hopefully I'm explaining that. And so that's why it'd be helpful if there was a little more of a distinction between capital charges from the rates, so that, and then maybe consider also if there's a way to, it actually is, maybe like a rolling two-year, this is the capital charges, and this is what taxes we're also going to be contributing to the federal debt repayment. So having more certainty about capital charges and taxes for the federal debt repayment would be helpful, and it would certainly help us with our budgeting process. So, and we continue to want to believe that it's good that CAP is utilizing all of the taxes that they are able to have as far as collecting them. Thanks.
So I just wanted as a reminder, I've said this before, sometimes I think as when a city gets up to talk and remind the board that, I'm here as a representative of a city, but as that city I'm representing 83,000 residents, So a lot of times when the change to our rates is sometimes blind because it's done at this board here, but it kind of gets hidden when I go to my council and I have to explain why those rates have changed after they've already been approved by our council. And I think sometimes it's hard to explain that story, especially when our budget is not on the same cycle as CAP's budget. So I guess just a reminder to put a face to the cities and all the residents that we actually represent. And, you know, when we go in for rate increases, you should see the amount of people that come to our meetings, our council meetings, and are very upset about those increases. And a lot of them are due to, you know, our subcontract going up. So that's just, I just want to put that out there, a reminder that we might be a city, but that city represents actual people.
I'll let you go, Cynthia.
Okay. Oh, I didn't realize this was on. I have a question about the slide that's shown. On there, the contemplated uses in 2021 for the property taxes that are collected in the three-county system, one of them says other options is reduced capital charges. Is that code for use taxes for repayment, for the repayment obligation?
Yes, and that was probably my bad wording on that, but yeah, it should say, you know, put towards repayment or something like that. The ones up there, that have a number next to them, we're starting to kind of circle in on a, you know, potential dollar amount, but those other ones below really could run the gamut from 0 to 10 cents, you know, depending on what's decided. So those I kind of put down as other because they're not ever going to be a targeted amount in any given year. They could vary quite a bit.
Yeah, I really have a problem with describing your repayment obligation as a reduction in capital charges. It's your repayment obligation. And actually in the statute that authorizes the board to levy the tax, the very first use of that tax listed is for the repayment obligation, if I'm not mistaken. I could be corrected, but I'm almost sure it is. And so I just think the way that you framed up this conversation is a little bit stilted in the sense that it implies that the reason that we want you to use the property taxes that are collected in the three-county area for the purpose for which the statute says therefore is somehow an effort on the part of the customers to reduce their capital charges. That's problematic. I think the other thing that needs to be noted is the capital charges have kind of been a little bit all over the place, and I think in a discussion that I don't know that we're going to pursue today based upon the Hohokam water issues, that they might even be more fluctuating. There's something to understand about capital, M&I capital charges. You know, we're not just the city of Phoenix, but the cities in the valley are large entities. And they have complex financing mechanisms and bonding. And those bonds rely upon stability in costs, among other things. And when you talk about capital charges, M&I capital charges, most bonding entities understand that that's more of a fixed or closer to a fixed. It's not always fixed, but it's something that they understand as being relatively stable. And so when we have these changes in capital charges or maybe quick fixes that reduce the capital charge or raise the capital charge, it can be either way, very precipitously from year to year, and these changes, and they're based upon sometimes, especially if you're doing it this way, where you're basing the capital charge based upon what other things you want to spend the tax money on. It provides a level of instability for cities that's just not acceptable, and really shouldn't have to be borne out by cities as well in that sense. So I guess I would say the same thing I said last year, and given the board's position on this, I suppose we're going to come and say it every year, that the property tax that's levied on households 3 county-wide, for the payment of the canal, which benefits everyone, not just the people who receive CAP water, benefits everyone. That's, and I'm using your words, not mine. That's in your reports and your studies, that it benefits the economy of all 3 counties, that should be the first and foremost use of that ad valorem tax, is to pay that obligation on the infrastructure. That is the canal. And, you know, that's not to say that you could never use any capital charges in there. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that should be the #1 thing on the list every year for the use of the ad valorem tax in some amount. So that's kind of where, that's sort of where we stand on that. I think there's some other issues that you want to talk about later, but I just thought we were starting with that one.
So I will pick up a little bit where Lacey and Warren left off with this idea of some further out forecasting of the capital charge in particular. We're always going to have the issue of our fiscal years not lining up. It's just something we're going to have to deal with. I do think that this idea of a 2-year forecast of firm capital charge rates would really help us on that forecast. If it continues to roll forward where I know you do a full rate forecast every 2 years, because the capital charges are not a rate, you could conceivably do that every year in a kind of a light fashion where you continually have a 2-year firm capital charge in there so that we can actually build that into that fiscal year budget. That would help immensely for those that have significant capital charge exposures. And regarding the order of uses of the tax monies, yes, we would love for it to, the repayment to be in the top tier consideration every single year, and some funds dedicated towards that as well. If you want to talk about the supplemental shortage stabilization, we can do that. It sounds like you're kind of on one roll right now, so maybe we can circle back on that one.
I just wanted to just put Hempy's 2 cents in on this, that similar matches what you've already heard, more certainty about capital charges and taxes for the federal repayment, and that, more planning in advance would be helpful for our budgeting process.
City of Chandler feels the same way. More planning ahead would be helpful, and some uses of the taxes towards the repayment every year would be, we would be supportive of that.
And the city of Glendale kind of echoes that same. It would be nice to get some assurance going year to year, jumping around from a cent and a half to 1 cent to, where's it going to settle out? And it would be really nice to see some assurance of what that would be, what the tax would be for the capital charge. So, and everything that Warren said also, we echo that too.
So flip my license plate to Sawa. Sawa's position on this is that every property owner that's paying the ad valorem tax may not directly receive CAP water, but that tax, the delivery of CAP has supported the economies of the entire service area. So everybody in an incremental way actually benefits from the fact that CAP water is being delivered. So Sawa's position is that the capital charge should not be borne solely by M&I water providers and subcontractors, but that a portion of the 10 cent into the future, not just next year, but into the future, utilize some portion of the 10 cent tax to cover capital repayment.
I just want to say that Goodyear agrees with our AMWA city's statements. And I'd just like to say that it's really important for us to have some certainty in our budgets about what we're going to need to use for capital charges. In Goodyear, that comes out of our CIP budget. And I've heard the statement before that, oh, cities can absorb that increase in cost. Well, we can, but that means that there's some other project we're not going to get to do that year. So maybe that's arsenic treatment, maybe that's a position. It might be something that we really need. We don't put frivolous things in our CIP budget. So that's why it's really important to us to have a little bit of certainty going forward on what those costs would be.
So in hearing some of some of the feedback, and I think it's some great feedback, I'm just going to throw a thought out that maybe this will help be a middle road of trying to address it, because as we've discussed before, one board cannot commit a future board on a tax rate. But similar to what we did last year in the taxes and said, let's take 1 cent and apply against 2 years from now. Maybe we look at the tax rate of this year's taxes. We don't apply to the next year, we actually apply out further. Maybe that's a way that would give you a little longer term that is matching a little bit of your budget cycles. I'm just throwing this out, we'd have to evaluate it, throwing it out off the top of my head right now, but it was just, it would give a little longer period if this board has already committed a certain amount that would be used in, say, 2 years or some fashion like that. Just thoughts on something like that? Would that help address some of it at least?
I'd just throw out that I think it would be prudent to have a conversation with the board about looking at how are we planning to use our taxes, not just for the next year, but for 5 years out, maybe even a little bit farther out. That way, there's some more certainty about, and the board would have a better understanding of why you need to be collecting 10 cents and not reduce that to some lower amount. As well as with the 4 cent tax, which there's lots being generated there too. So being able to show both the board and the public, this is what we're intending to use it. But give yourself enough flexibility with it, of course. But when I would agree that, the ag consideration, that's always listed, and yet it needs to be decided annually by the board. What would be wrong with always listing on there repayment, especially now that NGS is closed, and so I understand in the past with the Lower Basin Development Fund and how the excess sales from NGS helped cause the fluctuation between capital charges and federal, all of that. Well, we're now entering a phase where it's a lot more clear of what your federal, what your federal debt repayment is, and it's a lot more clear of what the two sources are for that. So, it seems that you could have a really good discussion with the board about, we're not necessarily locking you in, but we need to do more planning going forward, and we know what we're going to pay for the federal debt repayment. Why not go ahead, at least rolling every 2 years, maybe even 5 years, going out and saying, we're going to be committing this much to it or planning on it, and then the capital charges will make up, we'll balance it this way. And then we have the certainty of knowing that's what our capital charges are going to be. So I don't know if that helps, but I'm a little leery of, if you have some money here and we'll set it out for the next year. I think there needs to be a little more of a commitment or an agreement or understanding, at least by the board, that this is something that is the primary reason you were giving taxing authority, was to pay for the federal debt repayment, and therefore having it as a line item, the first one, is okay to discuss with the board and try to get some agreement on where to go. And I know there's differing views with the board, but I think it's important for staff and us to be maybe jointly conveying that message to the board of the importance of it.
I would just say that I appreciate the thought, the creativity of the thought, whether it's this year's taxes used for next year's dollars, or it's reserves that are taxes from previous years. There are funds available, says the guy who's not in charge of them. But there are funds available to make that a reality without tying it to the tax of that exact year. But the theory and the strategy of our repayment is our number one priority, I think, is probably what you're hearing from us, probably most loudly and clearly, I hope. And that's very important for us.
And just a comment on the ag consideration, because that is a legal requirement that we have to do that. The repayment is it was really a backstop to that we had enough to pay for the repayment if we didn't have money from other sources. Remember, there were three sources for the repayment, which was the power, the ag, and the M&I. The other two have been satisfied by or have been paid in full by the money that has come into the basin fund. While I think from a staff level, we've always supported that the rationale. There's a benefit of the CAP to all the taxpayers, whether or not they get water. But just a little clarification. That's why that one's always up there, is that we have to do that one based on the Water Settlement Act. So,
I totally understand, as well as understand that the board set a policy on extraordinary cost reserve, though that is still something they have to annually decide. And again, totally understand what has happened in the reasons for the past of when the taxes and because of the Lower Basin Development Fund and all of that. I'm just suggesting with the closure of NGS, it's a new day, it's a new situation, it's a whole new scenario where there's not that, where it's pretty much just capital charges or taxes. And so I think it's okay I think it would actually be very prudent and productive and beneficial to elevate the federal debt repayment in those conversations on taxes and be signaling to the board, we don't have the luxury of extra power being generated to help with that anymore.
Maybe I can provide a little bit of clarification for some of the concerns of how I worded this. And you alluded to it, the board policy says we start at everything the Basin Development Fund doesn't cover goes to capital charges, which is that $66 an acre a foot. So that's what we lowered it.
that's after the 1 cent.
Yeah, after we lowered it by the 1 cent from last year. So that's kind of the starting point. That's satisfying that policy is running that scenario. And so then in my head, when I was typing up these slides, that's why I went to the reduced capital charges as opposed to applying towards repayment, because I was thinking, okay, we've satisfied, at that $66 calculation, we've now done that, run that math. So now anything we apply towards repayment would bring that down. So it was just probably me getting out of order in how I loaded in that bullet. But yeah, no, your points are well taken.
I just wanted to make a point that the way that I read how the taxes should be used is I always have read it that its first duty is for repayment. It wasn't a backstop. It was kind of the whole purpose of CAWCD and the purpose of that tax. And I just really wanted to put that out there, that I feel like the way that's set up, and I know you said that you were going to relook how that's set up, but if I was somebody from the outside looking at that, that is not how I would view that. By the way it's set up, it makes it look like it's just an other option, like it's not as important as the whole creation of that tax.
Any other comments or questions related to the tax and capital charges? If not, then I think we can start the discussion about rate stabilization. And Eric, I think we'll start with you this time.
Sure, no problem. We would love to continue some similar version of the program as is currently in place. So if that's through a similar letter agreement or something like that, we'd like to do that. That's it.
This one's easy. Yeah, this one's easier. I think City of Tempe agrees as well that we'd like to continue to use those funds for the same purpose if we can, so.
Chandler would like to do the same, although I'd like to ask, is this a all or nothing proposal that everybody who's in it now has to agree to that,
I think that's a little bit open for discussion. Personally, I don't think that should be a requirement. That wouldn't be my initial recommendation. The nuance is we'd have to kind of create a new program if because of the way the current agreements, so we'd have to get all written agreements anyway. So, my push would be that we still at least have that $3 million minimum, just from an economy of scales perspective. So, this is open for discussion. We haven't, if you saw the discussion with the committee earlier, there's a few options. So just kind of laying them all out. That I don't personally see the need to do it. I don't know if you have a different opinion. But.
Okay. Yeah, no, it was just a question. I know that we've started some discussions, and we weren't going to talk about the Hohokam water issues right now, but there's some things with that we might want to discuss with staff on Chandler's behalf on deciding what to do. But.
City of Glendale also thinks it's a great idea to continue, so we would be willing to keep our funds in that, around with the same terms as we've had before. So, but we do think it's a good idea to go forth with that.
Just do me one favor as you're clear. Is your thought put another 5-year term on it? Just remove the term? I want some feedback on that. Or 3-year.
Well, I think for the City of Glendale, we want it there when we have to really use it. And so, looking at that term, I think we would be willing to go farther than 5 years. It just doesn't really pay to get the check back after we've gone through the budget. And, I think, it's really there for emergency purposes to really lower our rates. And I think that's what we're really looking at. So I think we would be okay with just having that at the discretion of that, maybe, voluntarily if at some point, and I don't know if that could happen, but let's say after a 5-year period, you could, below a minimum threshold of $3 million or whatever you would decide. But I think for us, we would want to keep it in there until we have to use it. So, and hopefully we never have to, but it'd be great if it was there. Yes, one day.
Fred Stevens, City of Surprise, thoughts on the voluntary rate stabilization? We're definitely in support of that. And term-wise, the 5-year, I think, works for us. With the uncertainty of the future, that could change, but at least, the 5-year period worked at this point for us.
SAWA's position on this is we would like to have the fund remain until such time as it's needed, with the funds that are at their current capacity that they are right now. We would also not want to see volunteers penalized in a fashion that when the voluntary amount of money is used, that is deducted away from what would be rightfully the funds available through the standard rate stabilization fund that everybody's paying into. And, even to make accounting simple, you could use up that volunteer. With SAWA members' position is that you could use that up in 1 year, and then it's done. And then the following year, the regular rate stability would be available still to those that are receiving water and have paid, continually paid into that rate fund.
We continue to support the voluntary rate stabilization program.
Yes, City of Avondale as well. We agree to keep that and until it's needed. So if you wanted to take the 5-year off, that's fine with us.
Doug? Just one clarification. I think just to be clear, when the comments are as the same terms, that would be if the board would then still be willing to keep the matching funds from CAP there. So I'm assuming that's what you're thinking also, but I didn't want to assume.
My initial thought is, it was matched at the 54.35. Maintain that in. If those that choose to not extend it or enter into a new one, those matched just for that portion would come back out. But I think the intent, at least my going in intent, would be to recommend that.
And I just wanted to follow up on this one. This is something we can talk about with a little more time. Something we don't have to decide, first quarter of this year or anything like that. And up there, we say we have 26 groups that opted in. Obviously, we don't have 26 groups giving us feedback today, so we're going to be reaching out to those who we didn't hear from and make sure there's some big partners in that group that need to voice and make sure that we don't start bumping against that $3 million threshold that we'd like to maintain because they don't want to participate anymore. But generally, it's good to hear a consensus of how those of you who are present would like to proceed. It gives us a good idea of where to start looking.
Any other questions or comments from the roundtable participants? If not, then we can make the call to the audience. If there is anyone in the audience that would like to speak, we are recording this. It will be on our website, so please raise your hand. We do have a microphone that we can get to you if you'd like to make any comments, but we'd make that call to the audience right now. Okay, not seeing any takers then. If there are no additional comments from anyone at the table? Chris? No? Deb?
This is my second time through this process. I'm still learning. It's a totally different experience from the first time we did this roundtable. I would also solicit your feedback on how we can continue to improve this process. And just want to extend an open invitation. If any of you want to touch base with me offline and talk about any of these issues, feel free. I'm always willing to take more input on these topics.
And along those lines, if you do have any feedback, there are feedback forms at the back of the room, so feel free to grab one on your way out, fill it out, or leave it with us today. But I'd like to thank you all for attending. We appreciate it, and we value your input. And those of you in the audience as well, thank you for sitting through this. Thanks.